So I'm Luciano Lustosa. I'm based in Lyon, France, and I work in Alstom, which is a 100% railway-oriented company. It's the result of the merge of the old Alstom and the old Bombardier Transportation. So we have a small team that's about 6-7 people working exclusively only giving support on obsolescence processes, tools to all Alstom sites, which I belong to. So Alstom nowadays, it became big, 70,000 employees worldwide, more than 100 sites, and each site has their own competencies in managing the day-to-day obsolescence issues, of course, but we need also to have a centralized support to all processes, tools, including a general view on risk assessment, which is the topic we're talking today. Alstom, they make everything related to trains, so tramways, TGVs, high-speed trains, locomotives, but also the signaling systems, passenger information, everything that is on board and off the tracks, let's say, not onboard equipment. Cybersecurity reasons, so it's something that we will talk more and more. Cybersecurity is closely related to software obsolescence, actually, a topic that we don't talk much, but it's a different discussion. And all services related to the long-term operation, 30 years, 40 years or more in railway systems. So that's for the Alstom activities. So how do we see obsolescence from a system level as an integrator provider on rail industry? Actually, we have a context that is the number of obsolescence issues is increasing every year, not only for the electronics that are more and more present in the trains, but also because of the REACH legislation issues we see that are increasing, as we saw in the previous presentations. In trains, we're having more and more new technologies, such as energy storage, fuel cells, hydrogen trains, supercapacitor for the electrification of the trains, trying to ban little by little the diesel engines, for example. So these are emerging technologies, and we don't know if they will be the same technologies in 15 years' time. So it's difficult to predict. So how can we obtain agreements with suppliers of these technologies today and having commitments for the long term? So it's a risk for everyone. And also that we follow the ISO or IRIS certifications. It's something that suppliers, Alstom as an integrator, and end customers are more and more making reference to these audit and certification. And one of the 22 topics under audit on IRIS certification is obsolescence management. So it's a good thing that we are giving more and more focus on the processes, implementation. And also the IEC, in 2007, it was only a guideline. It was a series of recommendations. And the latest version, 2019, it's more of a applicable standard with go, no go, let's say, series of requirements to comply with obsolescence. More and more customers are putting these requirements to be compliant with the IEC on tenders, so we need to follow this. So customers are becoming more strict, more precise on what they need in tenders. Maybe 10 years ago, customers only write, Alstom must manage obsolescence, which means it's very vague, it means nothing. Shall we monitor obsolescence? Shall we solve obsolescence free of charge? Shall we send alerts to the customer? So managing is a very vague word, a very dangerous word. And nowadays we are having, let's say, legal conflicts and discussions with customers on what was required in the tender specification years ago. So customers are learning from these mistakes and they're being more precise on requirements. And also customers are deciding that finally it's better to outsource to the manufacturer the responsibility to manage, monitor and solve obsolescence issues on the long term, because trains are becoming more complex and they are not able to do them in-house as it was the case. It's always important to keep the competencies in-house, but also to pass along the burden of monitoring and solving to the manufacturer. It's country by country, case by case, but this is a trend worldwide. So this is the global context on obsolescence. And we know this is the same for aerospace and many other long-term industries, that the life cycle of a small component, which is 3-5 years for components, and the life cycle for subsystems, let's say a air conditioning or braking subsystem in a train, can be 10-15 years, and the life cycle of a complete train or a signaling system should be 30 or 40 years. So this is incompatible, and the message we keep insisting to our customers is that obsolescence we cannot avoid. We can manage, monitor, find a solution, but it's inevitable. Even for tenders that we are preparing to customers, that we don't know if we will win the tender yet, we have on the train specified in the tender components that are becoming obsolete, and we are buying stocks just in case we win the tender, because things go so fast we cannot keep solving and monitoring in the same speed as things are happening. So this is inevitable. And another way to see things, we try to see from different angles what is risk assessment and in our components. We have the components, this one in red, because it's red because we cannot influence, we cannot avoid, or we cannot control. It's becoming from COTS, component off the shelf. Suppliers that are standardized products, they send us alerts, or we can collect the alerts, it's okay, but we have no influence on the life cycle of the product. So we put in red because we cannot control. We can monitor, but not control. And we have in the other extreme, the green, which is the train itself, the system itself, which we are the design authority. We can control, let's say, the specifications, the drawings, and the life cycle on this. So there is a conflict on what we cannot control and what we should control, the complete train as integrator. And we have something in between. We have some components off the shelf, but it's specific on railways that are in between, because we cannot control, but they are usually with very long life cycles on this. Well, you spoke this morning about REACH and ROHS, so I will just jump quickly on this, but this is affecting a lot on non-electronics for us. So gaskets, joints, polymers, solvents, so lots of things on the mechanical parts that we did not pay attention before, so it's becoming an issue nowadays, especially because suppliers usually send a change notification that can go unnoticed, and it will have implications on the long term on the products. So REACH and ROHS. ROHS is mainly for the non-lead soldering on electronics, which we are becoming compliant by now. This is a node legislation, but it's still an issue on how to repair older printed circuit boards that are still on lead solder. Can we use lead soldering on repairs or not? How can we migrate to new unleaded soldering? So this is another topic that we take special care. And finally, in a train or a signaling system, what goes obsolete? Well, nowadays we can say everything, not only electronics, but also software. We're paying more and more attention. We talk about cybersecurity. We talk about in-house software, about Windows. It's a big headache because many testing and production systems rely on older Windows software that we have no migration to the newer versions. Testing and production equipment is important. If we cannot repair or produce, we cannot sustain an equipment anymore. Usually we forget this. Mechanical and material parts, because of the changes on legislation, so it's becoming a more important topic to pay attention. And skills and processes, as you are the experts, every company has one person that knows how to maintain a system. If he's not there tomorrow, we cannot sustain anymore because we cannot always document in a perfect way what a company has. The knowledge of a company is in people, is the people. So skills and migrating and training is an important topic. So that's the general view on railways. Now I can jump on the risk assessment itself. The IEC talks a lot about obsolescence management plans. For every new product or project we have, we establish an obsolescence management plan, which is essentially identify the requirements of the project or the tender, and then we identify the parts, we identify what the customer is asking to us, and then finally we perform the risk assessment. We make a split on what is critical on obsolescence and what is not, because we have no energy or people to focus on everything. So we need to make a risk assessment. We split in reactive. We just react as the obsolescence happens, or proactive. We do things before the obsolescence happens. And then we record and report the obsolescence cases. And how we do the risk assessment? As a classical risk assessment approach, we make this split in two parts: likelihood and impact. How likely obsolescence will happen during an extent of time, let's say 30 years for a system, and how big it will be the impact if this obsolescence happens during this period. Likelihood is very product specific. It depends on the technology of the product, if the technology is getting old, if suppliers are discontinuing this kind of product. So it's product specific. And impact is, let's say, project specific. How big it will be the impact for your project if that item becomes obsolete in terms of penalties, reputation, the headache with the customer, and so on. So this likelihood is technology specific, and impact is project specific. It's contractually specific. In the old IEC norm, they used to make risk assessment in terms of probability, which we call it likelihood. It's a little bit different. Impact and cost. Nowadays, we consider cost as a kind of financial impact. So everything becomes impact, financial or not. So this is the way we can see. So if we have likelihood and impact, we classify in terms of low, medium, or high likelihood or impact. And then we make the cross connection between low likelihood and low impact. So it's finally a low obsolescence risk as we perceive it. High impact and high likelihood is a high overall risk assessment, and so on. So this is the idea. And finally, when you have low impact, you just stay in a reactive approach because the risk is low, so you just react when it happens. It does not mean that it will never happen. It will, ultimately, but you can afford to just wait and see. If you see the obsolescence, you start reacting after. And for the more proactive approach, for the high-risk items, it means that you need to monitor, take some measures even before the obsolescence happens. So this is the classical obsolescence approach we have. I'm just jumping to this. So just to complicate things a little bit, so I told about impact and likelihood. For all parts composing a railway system that we propose, we wanted to go a step further to have more measurable data on this. So when I talk about likelihood of becoming obsolete, I wanted to split in two factors. How many years do I estimate it will take before an item becomes obsolete? How many years? And how easy it will be to solve this obsolescence if it happens. So items can become obsolete very quickly. Let's say a display or a driver display. But maybe it's easy to find a replacement or an alternative if it's a standard display, I mean. So the combination of number of years and how easy I can solve this, it will make me a likelihood on the item becoming really obsolete with no solutions on this. And the impact is the same thing. How critical the part will be to my system. If it's a traction system, if it's a command and control system, it's very critical. Sometimes even toilet systems, subsystems are critical because if we have a failure, the train cannot be used in some cases. So how critical is the part to my system? But how quickly can I solve this obsolescence? If an item is very critical, but I can solve it easily, the impact is not so big, and vice versa, and so on. So we did this. We don't do this again and again for every project. We had this study once, and we reused this for all projects. So likelihood and impact are becoming this table, and then we make a big split on what will be a proactive approach or a reactive approach. This is a very high-level view of the main parts composing a train, the risk assessment in terms of likelihood and impact, the results, and finally, what we consider as a reactive approach. We solve the problem when it happens. And what is considered as a proactive approach? What should be monitoring, getting closer agreements with suppliers and so on, even before, from the beginning of the project. So this is the general view. And there are always exceptions. For example, for the bogie, it's a low risk. It's a mechanical rolling stock part. But inside we have sensors and some electronics, speed sensors, which are high risk and so on. So the more we enter into detail, more exceptions we find inside, which is normal. And for all this, so once we have these criteria of likelihood and impact for risk assessment, the next step is to make an identification of all parts composing a project or a product, a breakdown structure in a hierarchical way, not forgetting test tools, benches, software, and so on. And then we make the very detailed assessment on this. This is similar to what I showed you just before. So I have a train, let's say bogies. Inside the bogie I have cables and wheels. Inside the retraction I have maybe a diesel engine or electrical motor, and so on and so on. So I have the breakdown structure, and for each line of this breakdown, I made a risk assessment to finally see what we consider as a high risk or a low risk. And this assessment we did only once for, let's say, a generic train or system. Every new project, they just take this file and they just delete what is not applicable to their train. A tramway has no toilets, let's say. An electrical train has no diesel engine, and so on. So it's customized. So all this we did once, and then projects for all Alstom, they just reuse this analysis. And then there was still another problem. We had this hierarchical view of a train, but there is still the problem on generic materials such as fasteners, gaskets, metallic structures that appear here and there, everywhere in the train. They do not belong to a single system. In this case, we take another approach by commodity or by product type. So again, we made a risk assessment by product type. So we know for a specific supplier of that commodity if we consider risk as a high or low, and how we approach the suppliers. For example, seats, brake discs, windows, and so on. We take approach not by system, where it is in the train, but by commodity type, which is the material or the technology of the product. So it is still another view. There are several ways to take the risk assessment in order to cover everything we want to measure. And finally, all this risk assessment, it's ultimately to make a split in what we consider as a reactive approach. This is easy. We do nothing until we see a problem happening. So we start solving the problem once we knock on the supplier door and they say it's obsolete, they're not supplying anymore. So it's usually for items with lower technology, lower risk. And everything that we will consider as a proactive approach, which means obsolescence will happen, but we need to start taking some actions even before, by especially passing agreements with suppliers and making the monitoring. Basically speaking, it was like calling the supplier 2 times a year to say, hey, are you still there? Your item is still there, and so on. There are more sophisticated ways to do this, but this is the way to picture it. And once we have this split, so all about risk assessment, it's to make a split on things that we should be taking a proactive approach, but obsolescence ultimately happens, and then what we can react only when it happens. So every company, or including Alstom, we have a portfolio of strategies to this. Essentially, when we talk about being proactive, it's essentially taking special care on the design considerations, open technologies, intellectual property, obtaining the intellectual property and software source code, and so on and so on. And these 2 ones in the bottom, very important, it's always monitoring if the item is still available in the market and getting agreement with suppliers, which means for items that we consider as a high risk, we sign a charter with suppliers on which they commit for a period of usually 30 years. This is very big commitment. They commit to send alerts, obsolescence alerts to Alstom. They don't need to solve the problem at their own costs. Alstom can finance and pay for this, but they commit to send alerts to Alstom before the last buy order. So Alstom can buy stocks and start looking for a solution as soon as possible. So we don't find out 5 years later that the item was discontinued. We know, we get the alerts before. So this is the split of responsibilities that we like to place when we are being proactive. These kind of agreements work from non-specific items, such as components off the shelf. This is for more specific products. And for items off the shelf or more standard, we trust on monitoring using Silicon Expert, IHS Market, and so on and so on. So all those tools available in the market. And for solving issues, well, using stocks, finding replacement, buying stocks, aftermarket, cannibalization, virtualization or emulation, redesign, and so on. So this is the classical set of strategies that we have to solve problems. So actually, why do we make this risk assessment? The risk assessment is the basis of an obsolescence management plan. An obsolescence management plan, I see this in terms of what the customer is asking to us, what are the commitments they are asking to us, in terms of alerts, resolution, for how long. So what the customer is asking to Alstom is the what part. In the end of the document is the what we deliver, which should be a mirror of the requirements and the deliverables. So one is the mirror of the other. And in between is the big how we achieve that. So we note in the obsolescence plan who is in charge, which products are there, the risk assessment which we spoke today, what I am getting as agreement from suppliers, So this is the how part. So the risk assessment is the, let's say, the heart of the obsolescence management plan, which itself is the essence of obsolescence management, as we see. So this is the idea I wanted to share with you. And finally, I just wanted to mention that obsolescence risk assessment is not only about electronics, is one of the critical parts for sure, but it should cover rolling stock, signaling systems, services, test production tools, everything. So we must cover all items composing what we deliver. Reactive and proactive strategies is a way to focus on the high risk items only. Ultimately, everything becomes obsolete, but we cannot focus on everything. It would be prohibitive. And once we know what is critical, high risk, getting commitments from suppliers is essential. In an intelligent way, not asking everything, but knowing where to split the responsibilities and who pays what, getting things well clear in advance. This is the way we do. And finally, just this is only our policy, but it's always an effort to move from reacting, solving problems day by day, such as a firefighter, and moving this to the design phase. The more we anticipate things, this is the ideal world, but the more we anticipate, the better we have the operations in the long term. So this is an integrator view of risk assessment I wanted to share with you today. Any comments or questions?
I have a question right now coming from Martin Kromhout van der Meer. Question about the risk assessment. The matrix shows the results of a high level. Is the rating done at that level, or is it a result or combination of all components or parts?
The risk assessment at each level is the part itself, how likely that part, that subsystem will become unavailable or not. Yes. And inside, let's say, a high risk subsystem, inside that we may have smaller components with low risk, high risk, intermediate risk. But it's how likely am I to have that part under consideration to be unavailable.
Okay. So it means like you start from top, go down, and go down to each individual part, and then go back up, and because that results then vice versa into the end result.
Yes.
Okay. And there's another comment here. Very interesting presentation, just for your
just thanks.
Okay.
The bad news it was in English. My apologies. And good news is that it was the last presentation before lunchtime. Okay. Well, thanks to everyone.
So something that I would like to add at this moment, also obsolescence management has got, let's say, a kind of philosophy. It is in a certain kind of way that we have to think about planning replaces coincidence by error. This is what Albert Einstein told us. So now we are going to have lunch. Jetzt gehen wir in die Mittagspause. Vielen Dank.